Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to Sacred Soul Sunday. I'm going to give you guys the chance to jump on here and let me know that you are in the classroom. My name is Michael R. Mason, and I am very, very happy to be here. Um, Cultivating present moment awareness. Beautiful, lovely. Yes, it is. Cultivating present moment awareness. Um, from my experience, personal empowerment and present moment awareness begins with a deep curiosity. It begins with us asking why, really looking deeply into ourselves and recognizing that in a lot of ways there seems to be a disconnect from ourselves internally and the external world and a feelings of separation. And I believe it's through this deep curiosity to really know the nature of life and living and who we are and why we're here that we can begin to turn the inward to turn our focus inward into ourselves and begin to really start looking at like why we're here and what we're doing and looking at the ways in which the world has framed our reality and ways in which the world has created certain limiting belief systems and mindsets and frameworks through which we should somehow filter or interpret our experience, which in my case, as a young child I began contemplating like who I was and what we were doing here and all the things that I was told, and I had sought since maybe 13 or 14 years old to create this sense of inner peace. I could tell that when I had certain ideas, good ideas made me feel happy or whatever, things that I liked, and ideas that I didn't like, such as going to school and such, created a sense of resistance in me and had me kind of feeling down or unhappy or whatever. And so as a child, I can remember thinking, well, how can we bridge this sense of separation or this sense of unhappiness? How can I transcend these limited concepts, or how can I transcend my attachment to my ideas, so that I would be no longer controlled externally? My happiness would not be controlled through my ideas and my thoughts. That I could remain in a state of harmony and peace and happiness, irregardless of what was happening external from me. So that was the contemplation, that I started doing, and I spent many years, trying to understand, that. And it was about 18 years old that I had an awakening to my soul awareness, and all of my previous ideas that I had constructed as a sense of identity when I was a youth essentially crumbled away. And I had to rebuild a brand new framework of understanding who I was in relationship to the world. And I began to recognize that as our soul awareness wakes up, it has a certain frequency, and it attaches itself to thought structures that are in alignment with that frequency. So the more that we look inward, and the more that we stir up this the soul, it will become more aware. As it becomes more aware, it essentially seeks or discards structures, thought patterns, belief systems, ideas about itself in order to seek something that is more integral, that is more authentic, that is more aligned as a means of understanding or interpreting itself in the world. And that's why awareness is so relative. It's because it's relative to the individual's current awareness level. That's why knowledge is so relative. That's why information is so relative and paradoxical, because it is everybody is seen through their own lens based on their own self-understanding, in a sense. So, seeking inner peace. It was about 5 years later that I remember being a young father at work as an apprentice mechanic in a food manufacturing facility. That I have, I asked myself the most sincere question uh, possible. I said, how can I find this inner peace that I seek? What is the answer to this inner peace that I seek? And it was the first time in my life that I had heard a voice inside of my head in terms of clairaudience, and it was a female voice, and she said in a very soft tone, she said, "Give your life to God." And um, I was a little taken back by that because I knew it wasn't my voice, and so I asked, like, how am I supposed to do that? It's kind of silly, but okay, I got it. I'll give my life to God. And I wasn't really sure how to go about doing that, and I was sharing some of my experience with my mother's husband a month or two later or something, and he provided me a book called "Putting on the Mind of Christ," based on kind of some of the studies that he had been doing, and found certain similarities to my awakening at 18, where I became aware that I was the silent witness, and I was in observation of my own personality. And so I read this book and was deeply inspired by this book, and so I decided that this was the path that I was going to take to find the inner peace that I sought, which was essentially to put on the mind of Christ, or um, to surrender myself to be a vessel for God's love. And so I started doing that. I started to practice loving allowance and practice showing up in love. And irregardless of the circumstances in my life, in relationships, I was learning how to move with life and to become aware of my resistance to certain experiences or communication patterns, relationships with people. I made a commitment to become aware of how I could be more present in life, how I could show up in love, how I could become present with what I was resisting, and how I could like move and flow with that, how I could break down my intimacy barriers, and how I could truly show up as a vessel for this love. And I remember, um, one day on my way to work, I was probably 23 or so, and 24 maybe, and I was just like crying and asking the universe, like, just make me a vessel for this love, like, just do that. Um, and I came into work, and I got dressed, and I went through the doors of the office into the plant to go clock in, and Spirit gave me a sign that I was on the right path. Everything went completely silent, and I could see the illumination of bright white light and red colors all around me on my peripheral, on my side vision. And I remember a guy that I worked with coming up to me, and he was talking to me, but I couldn't hear anything. And so I essentially dropped into like a oneness where I was not even a person anymore. I was one with everything. And it was, it's complete perfection and silence and stillness. If you've ever been in um, like shock, if you've had an injury and you go into shock and you can't hear anything, it's kind of like that, only it was just a wonderful stillness, and then just a perfection of just like almost no self. And so I stayed in this like oneness for 3 or 4 or 5 minutes, and then it slowly faded back to normal awareness. And it's funny, I think on the path when we commit ourselves to growing and evolving our consciousness, and to be loving human beings, um, Spirit will always continue to give us signs and breadcrumbs and signals that we are on the path, and that we are, following our essentially our life path or blueprint that we are here to achieve. I mean, we all, we all create plans for ourselves prior to coming here, and We are birthed, in certain star alignments and certain families and certain agreements in order to facilitate the growth and the work that we're here to achieve in this world. And so we're always on the right path. I believe it is the intellect that unfortunately kind of has us doubting ourselves sometimes, that everything is other than perfect, because as we know, life is not easy, and there's pain, and there's hurt, and there's disappointment, and there's fear, and there's self-judgment, and there's a lot of different obstacles that we have to experience in order to make it through the journey. So cultivating, for me, as a part of cultivating present moment awareness, it became very obvious to me that part of that path was self acceptance and acceptance of others. And when we begin to like recognize the importance of acceptance, we know that it's so tied to moving through our resistance patterns, and our resistance patterns are the things that are tied into our soul awareness. They're tied into our unresolved fear and pain and insecurity and wounding. And so it is in like these resistance patterns that we can learn to nurture this place of like complete self-acceptance for self and others. And so by showing up in acceptance, we're able to begin to become more discerning and to cultivate a greater understanding for the fact that everybody's working through different resistance patterns. Everybody has different things within their soul that they are here to work through. And their limiting belief systems are always tied to what is unresolved within them. And so when we can begin to see how people are showing up in our space with certain filters and certain resistance patterns and certain blocks and certain, whatever, we can begin to create this space of like unconditional love. And it doesn't mean that we are always going to agree with people, and it doesn't mean that we have to be perfect, and it doesn't mean that we need to put up with bullshit. It just means that we're cultivating this great understanding, this wisdom that for the way that consciousness operates and for the way that people operate, so that we can break down these intimacy barriers and break down these illusions of separation, because it's always the mind and it's always the limiting belief systems and the judgment of self and others that makes us feel separate in the world. That's what creates the political parties, the religious, this and that, the country barriers, and all of these things. I mean, they're necessary for the movement of consciousness and the evolution of consciousness. But if we want to move into present moment awareness, if we want to learn how to live from the heart full time, if we want to cultivate unity consciousness, we got to begin to cultivate an understanding, a deep understanding for the way that life works, for the way that consciousness works, for the way that, for the mechanisms that hold us back or limit us from loving more fully, from being more present, from feeling more connected, from creating more emotional richness in our lives. And so for me, it was, a developing self-knowledge as a result of observation and looking for the whys in everything and building a framework of understanding for how life and people operate. And so I found that the ways that I could start cultivating a framework for this understanding of life, understand self-knowledge, was to be able to begin to observe myself more and more and more. And so what I would do is I began reading books that I felt had the least amount of distortion available, and that would provide to create a framework for the understanding of life and living, the physical and the non-physical, and all of these things that were my passion, which were to understand the patterns of consciousness and understand what life is truly about, understand what relationship is about, understand why we feel uncomfortable, why we are afraid, why we're scared to surrender, why we are scared of intimacy. And so I began to focus on my intentionality and look at the intentions behind my behaviors and my actions and my thoughts and everything. And so I started decoding reality. I started decoding consciousness so that I could open myself up to be the clearest channel of love available. I made a commitment during those years to, again, surrender myself to be a vessel for God's love. Years later, to be inspired by the love of God in every single moment of my life. And then essentially to be the full expression of love and inspiration and patience. Now, at the root of our behaviors, it's always about fear. And the avoidance of intimacy is what becomes a projection of those resistance patterns. And so the thing about becoming more self-aware and having more, developing more self-knowledge and learning how to be more present in life is that we have to be willing to surrender. We have to be willing to step into our vulnerability. We have to be willing to be completely honest with ourselves and call ourselves out on our bullshit. And we have to be willing to be courageous. We have to be willing to take complete self-responsibility for our choices and perceptions and to own up to the ways that we perceive and interpret life rather than, foisting our perceptions or our hurts or our pains onto other people because they're not fitting into the box of our reality, or because they're not meeting a certain ideal, or because they're not showing up the way that we want them to. Ultimately, we have to come to realize that it's our resistance that keeps us from moving through these limiting belief systems and moving through these self-judgments and the self-doubt and the feelings of not being good enough and not being worthy enough. Many times, the sense of unworthiness or not feeling good enough is not something that is conscious, but it's unconsciously driven through our resistance and through our fears and through the things that keep us feeling retracted rather than expansive in love, in trust, in belief in ourselves. And so what I've found through my experiences in life is that attachments, whether it be intellectual attachments, whether it be attachments to physical things in our lives, vehicles, jobs, money, and really in a lot of ways attachments to people, the codependent patterns that we experience. It's in those attachments that we recognize that we are still moving through fear and wounding and pain and insecurity and not feeling whole in ourselves, that we utilize the ego and our ideas and our belief systems and our behavioral patterns as a means of attaching onto things to feel safe in our lives. You see, the ego seeks safety, to step into our potentials, to learn how to live in the present moment, to trust ourselves, to recognize and realize and actualize our wholeness in terms of our masculine refinement and our emotional refinement and our ability to realize our truest potential. We have to be able to step through those shadows. We have to bring those shadows to the surface of our consciousness and to unfold ourselves and be willing to courageously, consistently show up and step into and through our fears. We all have fears. We all have resistance to certain things. We all have certain things that make us feel uncomfortable, that make us want to retract, that make us want to avoid or deny or push away or judge. But to become more present with life, to feel more connected with life, to feel more connected with love, we have to be willing to clear out our vessels, to clear out these vehicles, to move through these patterns, to become aware of what is serving us and what is no longer serving us, and to have the courage to change. Change is a commitment to love. Love is a movement of consciousness from individualization back to oneness. That is my experience. And so, by recognizing these attachments, we can learn to surrender to love, and we can learn to move with the wisdom of life. I believe that our job is to decode our consciousness, to decode our limiting constructs of the ego, and to recognize that the ego serves a wonderful and a beautiful masculine purpose in our lives. It facilitates our capacity to experience and express ourselves, to evolve our consciousness, to connect with people, to express how much we love and how deeply we feel, to facilitate all the things that we are here to do in the world. But the thing is, our ideas are not what we are. Our ideas are tools for expression and experience, and they are always going to be relative. And the movement of consciousness is moving from, intellectual or ego awareness to soul awareness, to feeling awareness, to heart awareness. Our job is to learn how to make that transition where our hearts become the CEO and the guiding force in our lives. And that courage and that expansiveness and that connection and that feeling of harmony and peace and trust for the inherent intelligence that is always supporting us in our unfolding, is always supporting us in our moreness and our greatness and our realizing of how awesome and beautiful and powerful we are. That intellectual awareness in many ways is unconscious, and it's the unconscious projection of our fears and our insecurities that keep us from feeling connected in life, that keep us from feeling ourselves, so that we can create the emotional space, the emotional richness to allow others to be with us, to be with others fully, and do not push them away with our intellects and our judgments and our expectations and our fears. That we can open up to life vulnerably and authentically and beautifully and harmoniously. This is our potential. Our potential is to learn to move with life, to trust life, to trust ourselves, to allow ourselves to fully show up in love, yet to have that masculine refinement, that discernment, that understanding, that being assertive and communicating effectively and taking action in our lives. That is our potential. That is our human potential, to show up more present in life, to show up in love, to move through our shadows and our fears and our blocks and our pain, and to allow other people to be who they are, because we are allowing ourselves to fully be who we are, to nurturing that inner child within us through kindness and through compassion and through understanding for how beautiful we are and how beautiful life is. There is no perfection to bliss, in my opinion, or enlightenment. There is no end game to consciousness. There's just a continual moreness and the capacity to be with life when it's hard, when it's very, very juicy and joyful and beautiful, all the spaces in between. But that we are truly making a commitment to our hearts, to love, to our potentials, to unfolding and decoding our consciousness, to bringing
the unconscious to the surface so that we can be so that we can live in the present moment, so that we can recognize the filters that we've used through our past experiences and realize how we are projecting our attachments or ideals into the future, and how we are losing our capacity to show up in the present moment through these mental constructs that are unresolved within us. Doesn't mean that we don't have wonderful goals in our lives. It doesn't mean that we don't reflect on our past, but that we don't allow those 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 realities that either have existed or could potentially exist to limit us from showing up fully in love and in our creativity and our potential to connect and feel joy and feel emotionally rich and to feel ourselves as the fullest expression of love that we are capable of embodying in this life. This is Sacred Soul Sundays. I am Michael R. Mason. I'm very thankful for you guys to show up here with me today. I love you guys very much. Have a wonderful rest of the day.